All right, now we're going to take a look at how to adjust brightness and contrast in an image. But before we get hip deep into that, let's take a look at the histogram in the upper right-hand corner of the workspace. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the histogram, you can go ahead and skip forward in this lesson. But if you're not familiar with the histogram is a visual graphical representation of the brightness of the image. It also gives you a look as to where the luminosity factors are concentrated, and in this particular image, it's a little bit on the dark side. There's very little in the super bright, blown out areas, but the darker areas of the image are represented. Now, this is what a histogram looks like when you have a perfect exposure. Now, that's perfect from a technical standpoint, not perfect from a creative standpoint. You may want something completely different, in which case you would ignore the histogram and simply work to achieve your vision of the image as you see it in your mind's eye. So this will tell you if you have a perfect exposure, which we do in this case. Now, let's briefly go over what you should not do. Do not use the brightness and contrast sliders. Those are terrible. They're awful. It's one size fits all. It does the exact same thing to every image and doesn't give you any creative control whatsoever. So we're not going to use this at all. The levels and curves dialog box are where we're going to center most of our time in adjusting brightness and contrast. The exposure slider is also terrible. Now, strangely enough, it's very good in Adobe Camera Raw. It's really good in DxO Photolab. It's very good in Capture One, but in Photoshop, it's terrible. So don't use either the exposure or the brightness and contrast slider to adjust brightness and contrast. Here's the levels dialog box, and we'll see the familiar histogram here. And I'm going to grab this slider in the lower left-hand corner, which represents the absolute darkest areas of the image. I'm going to move it to the right slightly, all right? And you'll notice the image change pretty drastically with just that tiny little adjustment. Now, you'll also notice that as I adjust this darker area slider, this middle, or what we call the mid-range slider, is moving in tandem to try to maintain a little bit of balance in terms of the overall brightness, kind of doing you a favor when you adjust this slider. Let's take this back to here. Now we do the same thing with the brightness slider, and we come down, adding brightness to the image. And you'll also notice that the mid-range slider is moving in tandem again to maintain balance in the luminosity of the entire image. So what I'm going to do is adjust this little bit right there, and then just a tiny little bit of overall brightness, and you can adjust this to taste. This is all subjective. Now, don't worry about this little area down here. It does serve a purpose, but if you're brand new to Photoshop, it'll just confuse you, so we're going to ignore this area right here. If you want to do research on your own, I'm sure that you'll be able to find tutorials on what these output levels do. But we're going to just keep it simple. And don't worry about these eyedroppers. Yes, they serve a purpose, but not now. Okay, now if you want to look at before and after, which I would encourage you to do, then of course you can do that. Now I'm going to set these sliders back to their previous position. And this is setting at 1. One thing I would encourage you to do is click on this auto adjustment, because sometimes you can be surprised. Now, I'll give you a word of warning about this auto adjustment. Go ahead and click on it and you'll see the result, and I don't like that, so I want to go back to where things were before, and you have to physically move this back here, and then you have to restore this value at 1 in order to get the image back to its very beginnings. I'll hit Tab again. All right, that's the levels dialog box. Let's go ahead and cancel that. My favorite way of adjusting contrast and brightness in an image is with the curves dialog box. This is what I use 99.99% of the time. Now, it's very similar. We do have our histogram in here, although it does look a little bit different, as you can see here, but the concepts are the same. In the lower left-hand corner, the absolute dark areas of the image. Let's grab this, move it to the right a little bit, and you can see the change in the image, just like that. Same for this area here. This is the upper right-hand corner, and you move this, and you can see what it does to the image. Now, in the middle is the overall exposure versus the overall exposure. If you want to do a global exposure adjustment, this is where you do that. You grab the middle of this line and pull it straight down, because it's maintaining more contrast in the image, because these are still and these are still. Now, if you really want to adjust things precisely, then you can take this one here and you can adjust this one up here and then adjust this one a little bit. Again, it's a completely subjective decision about what to do, but the controls are there for you to experiment a great deal. Now let's look at one of the basic adjustments on the curves dialog box, and that is what's called the S curve. So we're going to darken and then simultaneously lighten the area in the image. And this is before and after. And you can see the obvious improvement there. The colors are more saturated and the image has more contrast. Now, an exaggerated adjustment would be pushing up the brighter areas of the image and darkening the darker areas of the image. And you can see that it approximates an S, which is how it gets the name, the S curve. But it's a matter of degree as to whether you want to do that much to it. Okay, now we can also anchor this area. If you like the bright areas the way they are, then you can come down and pull down on these dark areas and make this adjustment look any way you want to make it look. And that's why I like the curves dialog box for adjusting brightness and contrast. You have so much control. Now there's presets up here which I never use, but they're there if you want them. Again, you can click on the auto tab here and see what you like. Here's before and after. So adjusting brightness and contrast, you'll get much, much better results by using the curves dialog box, and to a lesser degree, up here, to a lesser degree, the levels dialog box. Either one will give you decent results. You just have more precise control over curves than you do levels. Okay, so there you have it, brightness and contrast on your image in Photoshop.